How do you build a modern economy from the absolute ashes of an empire, especially when a solid decade of war has just shattered your country? Well, today, we're going to dive into the incredible story of how the Turkish Republic, really against all odds, forged its economic foundations from scratch. So let's start with this number because it is just staggering. Think about this. Between 1912 and 1923, after almost non-stop warfare, the population inside what would become Turkey's borders fell by a fifth, 20%. Major cities, like Istanbul and Izmir, lost huge chunks of their people. The workforce was decimated, farms were just left abandoned, and factories, they were silent.
And that's the central question, isn't it? With that kind of unbelievable human and economic loss, where do you possibly begin? For the brand new Turkish Republic, founded in 1923, the challenge was, well, it was nothing short of monumental.
So that first phase, the first decade through the 1920s, wasn't about some grand industrial vision. Not at all. It was about pure survival. It was about sovereignty and just trying to stitch the country back together again.
Okay, so this timeline shows the first absolutely critical steps toward getting economic independence. That Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 was a huge deal. It finally got rid of the capitulations. These were special economic privileges for foreigners that had basically crippled the Ottoman economy for centuries. Now, Turkey still couldn't set its own trade tariffs just yet, but this was the moment it started to take back control of its own economic destiny, even as it had to take on two-thirds of the old empire's massive debt.
For hundreds of years, the real backbone of Ottoman money was one single tax, the ashar. It was a 10% tax on absolutely everything a farmer grew. But, and this is the key part, it wasn't collected by the state. It was handled by private tax farmers who were notorious for exploiting the peasants. This system was ancient, and it was deeply, deeply unpopular.
And then, almost immediately, the new republic did something completely radical. It just abolished the tax. The whole thing. Gone. This wasn't just a tax cut. This was a fundamental signal. The government was saying, our number one priority is to help the small farmers, who, remember, made up most of the population. The hope was to kickstart the whole economy right from the ground up.
This slide just perfectly captures the change in thinking. Ottoman railways, they were built by Europeans for one reason, to get Turkish goods out of the country to the coast. The Republic's goal was the complete opposite. They wanted to build railways to connect the Turkish people to each other, linking the massive Anatolian heartland to the new capital, Ankara. I mean, they laid 3,000 kilometers of new track in just 14 years. It was a massive nation-building project.
So the 1920s were this period of really fragile recovery. But just as Turkey was getting back on its feet, just as it was about to finally get full control of its own trade policy, the entire world changed overnight.
The Great Depression hit the global economy like a meteor. And for a country like Turkey, which was mostly agricultural, it was just devastating. Just look at this chart. The price of wheat, the country's main crop, collapsed by 75% in 5 years. 75%! And prices for other key exports, like tobacco and cotton, they fell by half. The recovery was basically just wiped out. This was a brutal lesson. It showed that by being plugged into the world markets, Turkey's entire recovery was at the mercy of a crisis it had absolutely no control over. The old plan of just exporting agricultural goods, it was no longer an option. They needed a radical change, and they needed it fast.
And here was the response. It was immediate. The moment Turkey could finally set its own tariffs in 1929, it slammed the economic doors shut. Average import tariffs more than tripled, jumping from a pretty open 13% to a super protectionist 46%. The era of the open economy was officially over.
This crisis forced Turkey down a really unique and, frankly, controversial path. The thinking was, if the outside world can't be a reliable partner, then Turkey is just going to have to build its economy from the inside. This new ideology was called statism.
So what exactly was devletçilik, or statism? Well, it wasn't socialism, and it definitely wasn't free market capitalism. It was this unique third way, really born out of necessity. The idea was pretty simple. If private companies couldn't or wouldn't build the factories the nation needed to survive, then the state would do it itself. The government was going to become the main engine of industrialization.
And they put this policy into action with the first 5-year industrial plan. It targeted the absolute basics, the industries you need for self-sufficiency. So textiles to clothe people, sugar for food, cement for building things, and of course iron and steel, the real foundation of a modern economy.
And this table right here, it shows you exactly what happened. As the Great Depression scared away private investors, you can see their investment fell. So what happened? The state stepped right in to fill the void, boosting its own investment until it was basically a co-equal player with the private sector in building the country.
Okay, so let's just recap for a second. The entire world is in a devastating depression. Turkey has basically sealed itself off from global trade, and the government is taking over huge parts of the economy. You would expect a total disaster, right? Well, what happened next is honestly the most surprising part of this whole story.
Believe it or not, while the rest of the world's economies were shrinking, Turkey's was growing, and not by a little bit. It grew by a very healthy 3.5% per person per year right through the absolute heart of the Great Depression. By 1939, the average income in Turkey was actually 50% higher than it was before World War I.
So here's the big puzzle. The Turkish government was really fiscally conservative. They were all about balanced budgets and sound money, which means they refused to just print money or rack up debt. So if there wasn't any big government stimulus spending, how on earth did this incredible growth happen?
Well, the first part of the answer, the first big driver of that growth, was those massive tariff walls. That policy of intense protectionism was absolutely key.
And when I say intense, I really mean it. Tariffs on basic things like textiles shot up over 80%. On sugar, they hit 200%. This, along with tight controls on foreign money, basically created a captive market. If you wanted to sell your goods in Turkey, you had to make them in Turkey. And that forced the creation of a whole new industrial base.
But that protectionism alone doesn't explain everything. The second driver was something quieter, something happening out in the countryside, and it's a part of the story that often gets overlooked.
You have to remember, agriculture was still half the entire economy, and it employed 3/4 of the population. And here's the wild part. Even though global prices for crops were terrible, agricultural production inside Turkey surged by 50 to 70% during the 1930s. And the reason? It was peace. With the wars finally over, the population was recovering and growing, and millions of acres of abandoned farmland were being used again. This boom provided cheap food for city workers and cheap raw materials for those new state-owned factories, fueling industrial growth right from the land itself.
So, in the end, forged in the fire of a global crisis, Turkey created this truly unique economic model. Statism and protectionism, they worked. They built a domestic industry, and they delivered growth when the rest of the world was failing. But it came at a price. It created an inward-looking economy that would really define the nation for the next 50 years. And that leaves us with a final question to think about. What is the true, long-term legacy of choosing self-sufficiency over being part of the wider world?